Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to this week's international webcast featuring our president and founder, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. When we came to you last week, we were possibly on the verge of a world war breaking out. And one of the things that we said in that webcast that Helga emphasized is that if we can get through this period, there's an opportunity to take down the British imperial apparatus, which is behind the war drive. What we've seen in the last few days has been an exposure of the lies coming from Britain. We had been exposing it. We'd been out in front on that. But now we're seeing it from various institutions of governments, even in some media. So I think this is where we should start. We're now at a point where these exposés give us the opportunity that we've needed for a long time, which is to take apart the British imperial geopolitical apparatus. So Helga, what's the potential for that happening now?
Well, I think it is quite amazing, but there are more and more countries, governments, and also political forces who are speaking out against the fact that many of these British operations were orchestrated. And just to name the most recent ones, the role of the British government and MI6 in the Russia Gate is fully in the limelight. Then the whole Skripal affair is also now, basically questioned by many in respect to, who really did the attack. And then naturally the recent military strikes because of the supposed chemical weapons used by the Assad government is also falling apart. So I think that there is now an increasing awareness that there is one country which is really on a war drive against Russia, and despite nice words, by implication, also against China. And that, I think, is a very important turn. As a matter of fact, this afternoon, there was a press briefing by the Russian foreign spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, I don't know exactly. And she apparently went into a lengthy description of all the operations, starting with, operations against the Soviet Union, the British work with the fascists in the Ukraine, and then also more recent cases. So it's a long history. And, I think one has to really look at the speech which Theresa May made last November, where she talked about a new global Great Britain. And she just appointed a new defense chief of staff, Sir Nick Carter, who is basically, also talking about, a complete tirade against Russia, Russia being involved in all evil deeds from, corruption, cyber attacks. I mean, it's really a rampage. And I think the forces which are behind this war drive is the British government, self-exposed now in its own name, but naturally also the neocons who are trying to get hold of Trump and manipulate him into their cause, despite the fact that President Trump was elected on the basis of him having promised not to have interventionist wars anymore. So it's really a huge battle going on, but I think the exposure of all of these British lies is a new phenomenon, and it makes also those governments which gave unconditional support to these military strikes look really bad. They lost all credibility because, they don't care for truth. And when they join in these groundless attacks against Russia, I think it will lead further to the collapse of the Western system, because many people see that these governments cannot be trusted. And that's not a good thing, but that's what's happening.
Well, I think before we go into some of the specifics on this, it's important for you to identify for our viewers what the cause of this whole operation is, because you've taken the lead in making sure that people understand that this is not just mistakes being made, but is an intent. So if you look at the common purpose behind Russiagate, the Skripal affair, the Duma events, just remind people, what is the essential argument here that's being put forward by people like May, Nick Carter, the British Empire, the neocons in the United States?
Well, obviously, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, these forces thought that they could impose an unipolar world, get rid of all governments opposing such a system by regime change, color revolution, interventionist wars, which is what we have seen, especially in the 16 years of Bush Jr. and Obama. And, Obama even said, Russia is just a regional power. And, nobody expected Russia to return fully back on the world stage, which Putin successfully did by turning around much of the economy in Russia, but especially also reestablishing a strategic balance with the West, with NATO. And naturally, the rise of China is, what these people also underestimated and were arrogant about. Now you have a flood of articles saying, "Oh, the new rise of China, or the new proposals with the new Silk Road." I mean, this is not new. This is almost 5 years, and I think what you see right now is a realization of the geopolitical faction of the neocons in the United States, the Democrats, which are really obviously neocons also, and the geopolitical British faction in Europe, that they really are in a rear guard battle trying to prevail with their system when their system is clearly inferior and outdated and not attractive to many countries in the world who see it much more advantageous to work with China and also Russia in building up their own economy. So this is really the battle at stake. And obviously it's very dangerous, but I think to the extent the lies being used by the British in particular, naturally Macron went along and they got Trump temporarily lured into this scheme. I think the more these lies are exposed, the less they are effective and the less is the danger that they are being repeated for the next dirty trick.
Well, and one of the areas that the Russians in particular have been going after is demanding a full investigation, both of the Skripal affair and Duma. And now we see there is a team from the OPCW that's gone into Syria to take a look. And this is causing a real panic from the British, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, especially because, now some of their own people, like Robert Fisk from The Independent, but also some former ambassadors, they all, point to the fact that the White Helmets is really a terrorist organization, that they are working as humanitarian first responders in the day, and then in the night they turn into killers. This was a formulation used, by the way, by one of the most famous Chinese journalists, Yang Rei, in CGTN, who used that image, but also Peter Ford and Craig Murray, the former ambassadors of Great Britain, and also even some former military, basically all questioning that the cui bono, the motive, is for sure not with Assad. Why would Assad do that? His ally, Russia, obviously stated that they got rid of all chemical weapons with Russian surveillance. And why would Assad risk the relationship with Russia by using chemical weapons? Also, the moment does not make any sense because Assad is almost in total control of the major parts of Syria. And, why would he, at a point he is winning, risk to bring the, thunderstorm of Western anger against him? So the cui bono is clearly in those people, on the side of those people who want to disrupt that process. And, it has been pointed out to the fact that the White Helmets are a completely not only a terrorist organization working with Al-Qaeda and some other groupings, but they are financed by the British government. They are financed by USAID. And, there have been even reports saying that they were instigated to speed up this phony scenario in order to create a pretext for this attack. So this is all coming out, and I find it quite interesting, while Theresa May is trying to play the game on the one side being the super hawk against Russia, but at the same time somehow portraying herself as initiating a golden era between Great Britain and China. So there was a telephone discussion in which President Xi reiterated this golden era between the two countries, but then he said that in the case of Syria there must be an absolute thorough investigation establishing the truth of what really happened, which will stand the ground historically. So I think this is a very good move, and I think the possibility that this whole story comes out and is being put on international trial, because these are war crimes. What has happened? I mean, you cannot attack a sovereign country without UN Security Council agreement, or being in another defensive mode. But this was a clear violation of international law. It was a violation of the UN Charter, and I think that this is now causing a gigantic counter reaction. And I'm absolutely confident that the truth will come out.
And Helge, when you bring up Theresa May, I understand you've picked up that there's a conflict of interest that she has in terms of her relationship to the military-industrial complex. Why don't you fill our listeners in on this, because I don't think this has gotten much coverage.
Well, she is married to Philip May, and he is one of the top managers of an outfit called Capital Group, which happens to be the largest investor in BAE Systems, which is the largest weapon producer of Great Britain. And Capital Group is also the second largest investor in Lockheed Martin. And it happens to be that BAE and probably also Lockheed Martin, they made a lot of profit out of these military attacks, because 8 missiles produced by BAE Systems were used in the strike against Syria. And as a consequence, the stock prices of these companies went absolutely up. So, if you have a prime minister who can declare war and her husband makes the profit of it, I think you have a clear case of conflict of interest, if not something worse. So I think that should also be investigated, because the already mentioned Yang Rei, the Chinese journalist, pointed to the fact that one should investigate the role of the military-industrial complex in this whole affair. So I think that requires some limelight. And, here you have a clear violation of international law for, among other things, not only geopolitical reasons, but also naked profit-making of themselves, filling their own pockets.
Well, as your husband once said, if you have something to hide, you shouldn't go out attacking other people. And certainly the case in dealing with May and the neocons. Helge, one of the things that came up is there was an attempt to get the European Union to support the UK, US, French strike. That didn't go too well, did it?
No, as a matter of fact, the public opinion in Europe is the vast majority against this, because people sense that this is something horribly wrong and could lead to a war with Russia if it's not stopped. So I think the fact that the EU foreign ministers at their meeting on Monday were trying to get a post-fact support resolution for these military strikes did not function. It was basically 2 important EU foreign ministers who opposed it, the one from Italy and from Belgium, with the argument that it would unnecessarily aggravate the tensions with Russia. But then there were also a whole number of European Union member country foreign ministers who are not belonging to NATO, and they also refused it. Austria, very important, Finland, Sweden, Cyprus, Malta, and probably I forgot one or two. I think the case of Austria is very important because the foreign minister of Austria absolutely blasted this and insisted that this was a violation of international law, which Austria would absolutely not go along. And as you know, the Austrian government just came back from a very successful trip to China, where both the president and the chancellor agreed with Xi Jinping that Austria and China would develop the closest relationship in the Belt and Road cooperation. So I think this is one more sign that the famous unity of the European Union is not existing. It doesn't exist on many issues, but fortunately also not on this one. And it just shows you that this EU construction is a terrible one. And the sooner it changes into something better, a higher principle, the better the world will be off.
Now, Helge, one of the other points I think is very important to pick up on is in the timing of this, the whole white helmet charge of use of chemical weapons came right after President Trump came out and said twice in a week that he's preparing to move troops out of Syria. He wants the U.S. out, fulfilling his campaign promise. And this is something that was picked up by people like Tucker Carlson on Fox News. Roger Stone brought this up in his commentary. Pat Lang brought it up in his Sic Semper Tyrannis article. And as this was occurring after the attack, the UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, who's one of the hardest core neocons, she was a supporter of Jeb Bush during the presidential campaign. Somehow she's UN ambassador. But she went out on the talk shows last Sunday and said the U.S. is going to stay in Syria. This was what Macron had boasted, that he had convinced Trump that the U.S. will stay in Syria. And then Haley also, I'll get to that in a second. But anyway, it's clear that then Trump came out the next day and said that's not the case. The U.S. is not going to stay in Syria. He wants the troops out. And then also the other thing Haley said is there'll be new sanctions against Russia. And Trump walked back away from that also, saying that's not the case. So this indicates a fairly intensive fight in the United States with the neocons doing everything they can to break any possibility of Trump and Putin talking. But you made the point, and I believe this was picked up in the Russian media, that Trump and Putin should meet as quickly as possible. How would you see something like that working?
Well, I think it is very clear that Trump is in a very difficult position because after the raid concerning his personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, there are now people worried that if Mueller, whatever his name is, threatens Cohen with a life sentence in prison, that Dershowitz, the constitutional lawyer, said that this is aimed to turn Cohen into a canary which sings. There's a question, if you are threatened with a life sentence, then maybe people some people are not strong enough to stick to their loyalties. So this is a big concern. And, we have experienced these tactics sufficiently ourselves to know how this works. But, Trump is also surrounded by people who are obviously trying to get him back to the Obama agenda. I mean, this was a point made by Roger Stone in his recent article, where he said, the effort is very much by the neocons to lure Trump into scenarios which basically undo what he promised in the election campaign, to have a better relationship with Russia. And, he has already established a very good relationship with Xi Jinping. So how do you outflank this? Obviously everything, world peace, the whole question of the future of mankind, as I have said many times, depends on the most important countries getting a better relation. That is the United States, China, and Russia. And, the best thing for all these petty and nasty attacks to be outflanked would be a quick meeting between Trump and Putin, because I'm absolutely convinced that these are two people, despite all of the criticism one can have of the one or the other. I'm not saying, that you have to support every step what they're doing, but it should be clear that they have proven many times that they have better instincts. Without Putin's intervention in Syria, we would still have a total, madhouse and possibly a situation in Libya where terrorists would be in command completely. So Putin has proven that he can strategically outflank a seemingly hopeless situation. Trump, despite all of this Russiagate and unbelievable treason also from many of the Republicans, the Democrats are pretty obvious. I think he has proven to be quite resilient. And I'm absolutely convinced that if these two would sit together in a long summit, that they would come up with solutions for all of these problems, including, the strategic partnership between China and Russia is a very important factor in this. So I think that, sometimes when you have seeming contradiction on a lower level, which apparently cannot be solved, you just have to catapult the whole debate on a higher level. And I think that if Putin and Trump would meet very quickly, this would be the most beneficial thing to happen.
Well, and on that note, we have also the whole question of where do things go from here in Syria? And there was a statement issued the other day that the Syrians are looking at the Chinese model, that they'd like to have something like that. The Chinese have indicated they're willing to come in and help reconstruct. Do you think it's possible that some of the European countries would get involved with China in a reconstruction in Syria?
Well, I think Italy is doing it already. We discussed the Chinese-Italian cooperation in the Transaqua project. I think some others have a harder time. Mrs. Merkel, who just completely endorsed this military strike, which was really a terrible thing, she now wants to meet with President Putin to mediate between the United States and Russia, and she also wants to play a role in the reconstruction of Syria. Obviously, their position is still that Assad has to be gotten rid of, and I don't think that anything the European Union or the German government have done so far would indicate that they really are willing to change the paradigm. Now, the Syrian ambassador to Beijing, on the other side, said that Syria is welcoming not only the role of China in the reconstruction of Syria, but that Syria wants to adopt the Chinese economic model because of the strong role of the state and the fact that the state in the Chinese model is protecting especially the lower and poorer layers of society, weaker layers of society. And I think this is very good. I would wish that reason would enter the minds of some of the European governments and that they would just join hands. I have not seen yet a sign of that. As a matter of fact, the German EU Commissioner for Energy, Oettinger, just said, Europe should not be a fortress Europe, but we should bring development to Africa. But then, he said, that this should be done in order to not leave the African continent to the Chinese, who would only follow their egotistical aims. And as long as this idiotic thinking prevails, I don't think there is any solution. I think people should just recognize what China is doing and stop having these prejudices, because if you compare the moral quality of what China is doing for its own people and other nations, it is vastly superior to what the West is doing.
I think it's fair to say the German government is also very far behind the thinking of German industry and the Mittelstand. because they're very much welcoming the Chinese involvement in Duisburg and Hamburg and other places where the Chinese are coming into Germany with a whole series of projects. Now, that brings us to the other question, China-US relations. There's a very significant conference at the Brookings Institute just, I think, yesterday, and we had a very important intervention in that. The topic, again, was US-China collaboration. What happened there, Helga? What can you tell us?
Well, there was the head of the China Development Bank and also the annual report of the International Financial Forum was presented at this Brookings event. And one of our colleagues, Mr. Gallagher, intervened and asked, if it was not a good idea for the Chinese to help the infrastructure development in the United States using an infrastructure bank or a national bank to basically use the US treasuries for such investments. And, while the representative of the Brookings Institute was relatively surprised by such an approach, the Chinese representative on the panel basically elaborated this idea and fully endorsed it and said this would work very well, and it's a very important question. So it's very important that this is put on the table because, this is what we have proposed since, I think, back in 2015 already, that, the best possible way to put the US-China relationship on a solid ground in terms of cooperation with the Belt and Road Initiative would be Chinese investment in the infrastructure in the United States, and then in turn have US investments in joint ventures in the countries along the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think this discussion is absolutely urgent, because that way you could also get rid of the trade imbalance by just having more trade, not just bilateral trade, but multilateral arrangements in the new Silk Road. So I think this is very important. But let me just mention what I really refer to by the higher moral approach of China. And I know that some of our viewers will get upset about what I'm saying now, but I find it very, very useful that China has now launched several campaigns, one against internet addiction, another one against hip hop, saying that the hip hop counterculture is just about white powder, women, girls, sex, violence, and that it promotes a vulgar and low taste, and therefore should not be on the internet or TV channels, and just not be promoted. And then the Chinese government is calling on companies to promote healthy and beneficial, truthful knowledge instead. Now that's, I think, a good idea, because the media, they are not the devil. They could also be used to promote useful education of the population instead of pulling them down with terrible violence and crime and, just awful ugliness, as it is happening in the West, in all the movies and all the entertainment. And they also make a campaign against quiz, because a lot of people are, participating in banal quiz, and they say this is also bad because it promotes mammonism, also money greed, the search for riches, which is also to be discouraged. And I think it's very good because, the government should have a role for the common good of the people. And I think that the famous liberal model of the West, which, is being hailed by some as the absolute reason why it should be legitimate to make interventionist wars against countries which have different social models. Well, I think it's much better if a government protects its own people against things which are clearly bad for the cognitive powers of the population. And I think nobody would lose anything if some of these terrible things would not exist. I think the youth would be in better shape. And President Trump has taken up this issue of violent video games as being one of the contributing factors to violence in the schools and so forth. So I think, this is one of the areas where a useful cultural dialogue among countries could also take place. How do you protect your own population against such bad influences? And I think this is a very important component of the strategic picture.
It would also be helpful if the media stopped lying. Now, Helga, I have one more question for you, which is something that I get quite a bit in the radio interviews that I'm doing. These whole events of the last couple of weeks caused a lot of people who were hoping that we were moving into the new paradigm to lose their hope, lose their optimism. And I had a number of people say to me, how can you still be optimistic when we're seeing the United States once again, whether it's willingly or getting suckered into a war, launching missiles against a sovereign state in which we've not been invited to participate? And I have my way of answering it, but I'd like to hear your answer, because I think this question of how do you sustain an optimism so you can fight and fight for the good is something that people have to hear over and over and over because of what you were just saying. Otherwise, they're dragged down by the media. So how do you approach this situation, and why are you still optimistic?
Well, there is right now in certain European political layers a big debate, has the deep state in the United States won already, or is there still some options that Trump could stick to his announced policies? Well, I mean, obviously the deep state is, or what people call the deep state, which is this, what President Eisenhower already pointed to, the military-industrial complex combined with the intelligence services belonging to the British Empire faction. Obviously, they are still very strong. But on the other side, I think they have never been so exposed. And, at a time when ordinary people have the feeling that everything is falling apart, the trust in government is collapsing, pensions are not seen as secure, there's fear of a new financial crisis, much worse than 2008. People have a sense that, there is really no institution. I mean, in the West, people have the sense there is no place they can turn to in terms of trust. And, in such a moment when people realize who are the warmongers and that they are pushing war against Russia using lies, I think this can completely backfire. And once these lies are being dismantled and ostracized, and the people who are pushing the lies are being ostracized, I think there can be a real return to an international relation among nations, not only reviving the UN Charter, reviving international law, but also, I think that sometimes you need a shock like this present experience to move to a new paradigm of international relations. And I think that is something absolutely on the horizon. And, I don't think it will go as peacefully as it was with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which after all, without using tanks, agreed to the unification of Germany, agreed basically to the disintegration of the Warsaw Pact. So I don't know. I don't have a clear idea how this present, collapse phase of the Western system will end up. When you see a dynamic where more and more countries are not going along anymore, the East European countries, the Central European countries, the Balkans, the South European countries, Switzerland, Austria, I mean, they all want to have a different kind of relation. And the more countries have that kind of a determination, and in those countries who are not yet there, like Germany, France, Great Britain, the more people mobilize and speak out to stick to the truth. There are many people in motion right now. There are many appeals, being circulated of people who say we have to return to reason. We have to have a good relationship with Russia and China. Without these two countries, no problem on this planet can be solved. And the more people start to engage in such a discourse and get active, and that's why I'm each time calling on you, join the Schiller Institute, help us to get these video webcasts around, spread the word, get active, the better it is. I'm absolutely convinced, I'm in one sense a Leibnizian, believing that a great evil always generates the potential for an even greater good, because that's the laws of the universe. I think the universe is made in such a way that, there is this tremendous ability to improve, to become better, to have higher forms of existence. And, it does require the individual action. It's not a dialectical materialism or historical materialism which goes by itself, but there is such a thing like a combination of objective conditions and a subjective intervention, and the objective conditions do exist. They exist in the form of a new paradigm promoted by all the countries participating in the Belt and Road Initiative. And if you add to that the subjective factor, which is the courage of the world historical individual acting on the basis of his or her knowledge, I think there is all the chances that we can move humanity into a more safe historical period. So therefore, I can only appeal to you, join us. That's the best thing you can do.
Well, one institution which has earned your trust is the Schiller Institute. Since its founding in 1984, we've been ahead of the curve on virtually every single fight. And I think it's important, as Helge just said, to encourage you not to give up hope, but to find in yourself the strength to get out and wage this battle, to talk to people, to bring the light of reason, the new Silk Road spirit to them. So Helge, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll be back again next week.
Yes, till next week.